Hey there, in this video we're going to look at how we can format strings using Python's built-in string formatting. Starting in Python, I think it was 3.5, 3.6, a couple versions back, they added something called f strings. So your typical string is surrounded by quotes, either single quotes or double quotes. To make it an f string, you append an f to the very beginning. And what that does is it tells Python to look for any brackets in there. Anywhere it sees brackets, it's going to try and do a substitution. In those brackets, you can put any variable that you've defined in your code. Python will evaluate that variable and place it into the string. So for example, let's create some variables. We'll make x an integer here. Let's make it, say, 23. And y will be a floating point number. Let's make it 11.11. And we could put those into our formatted string to see what it's going to look like. So Python automatically substitutes the variables x and y and puts them into our string. Now it can happen that you have, say, a lot more decimal places than you really want to display. So we can add some formatters into these f strings. The way this works is you add a colon right after the variable name, and then you type out the formatting code. There's a whole list of the formatting codes available. You can look just below this video. I'll have a link to the documentation. We're going to run through just a few of those right here. So if we're going to format a floating point number, the format code is f. This attaching the f here doesn't really do anything because Python was smart enough to realize you had a float to begin with. The power comes in when you start adding to that. So let's say I just want to show the first two decimal places. What I can do there is hit .2, so it tells me I want 2 digits after the decimal place. And we can see that my 11.11 was dropped to 2 digits. You might wonder, does this do rounding? So like, make this a 9 right here. Is it going to say 0.12 or 0.11? And the answer is it rounds, which is typically what you're going to actually want. We can also control how much space is left for each of these. So if I want to have a lot of space, let's say I want a space for 10 digits, because what can happen is you might be printing out a list of numbers and they're different lengths and you'd like them all to be aligned as they're printed. So if we type in a 10 here that says give me 10 spaces for this floating point number, and so it gives me this extra space, it's off here to the left. We could do the same thing for this integer. The difference there is that the format code is D for decimal. We can give it space for 10 digits as well. Having a decimal place here doesn't really make any sense. But what we might want to do for our decimal number here is we might want it to start with zeros. Like suppose I'm going to make a list of numbers that looks like 1, 2, 3, and then we have like 10, 11, and I'd like everything to be aligned. One way to do that would be to have zeros in front of these, something like this. And I could tell Python that's how I want it to print its decimal numbers by putting a 0 in front of whatever I put here. So 010D, I print that, is going to say pad it with zeros. So I always have, in this case, 10 zeros, because I told it I want to have room for 10. More typically, this would be a smaller number, like maybe 03D. Python will also support Printf style formatting. This is the oldest print format for Python, and it goes all the way back to languages like C. And so if you're familiar with those languages, you may already be familiar with the format codes for Printf style formatting. We won't really use that, at all in this class. It's okay if you use it; it won't hurt anything. Just to show you what that looks like quickly. A similar sort of code to printing x and y would look like this. So I would do a %d or a %03d, print my x, and I would do a %10.2f to print my y. You notice I don't put the x and the y in the string, they go after the string. I use % here as a special operator, and then in parentheses here, actually as a tuple, I list what I want the arguments to be. So I want them to be x and y. Okay, so if I run this, it produces the same output. You can see the similarities, so if you've used printf, it's not too hard to transfer over to format strings. I think the great thing about format strings is you can put the variable right in place. You don't have to remember what order your arguments were in. It makes it, I think, a lot easier to keep track of. So what I want to do now is just a quick example here showing how we could use a format string to make nicely printed output. So I'm going to write a short program that prints sine and cosine for a range of angles 0 to 360 degrees. Now since I'm going to be doing some some math, some trigonometry, I want to use a few functions from the math module. So I'm going to import pi, sine, and cosine. So I have access to those. And now let's print a header for what I want to print out. So I'm going to make basically a table of values that's going to have theta in degrees, theta in radians, cosine theta, and sine theta. And let's print that real quick just to see what the header for my table would look like. And then I'm going to use a for loop to fill in the rest of the table. So let's do theta going from 0 to 360 degrees in steps of 30 degrees. That would be for theta in range 0 to 360 with steps of 30. And then we're going to print out some values. Now, I know that sine and cosine are expecting values in radians, and I'm calculating thetas in degrees, so I want to do a quick conversion to radians. So that would be theta on 180 times pi. So rad here will be my angle in radians. And now let's print out the contents of the table. So I'm going to print out theta, the angle in radians, cosine of the angle in radians, and sine of the angle in radians. Okay, so if I run this code, you can see it was not formatted very nicely, especially if we look at like the first line here versus the following lines. We have just 0 or 1 decimal places, Python putting just this 0.0 here for our floating point numbers. But then some of these are really long, they're different lengths, they're more decimal places than I probably want at all. So it's a good place to use string formatting. So first thing I'm going to change is, instead of having a print statement of a bunch of individual things, I want to make just a single F string that surrounds everything. I'm going to get rid of these commas because I don't want it to literally print the commas. And I need to make sure I surround each of these variables with curly braces, otherwise it would literally print the text I have in the string. Okay, so that's identical. All I did was switch over to using an F string. And if you're wondering, we are allowed to include text in addition to these braces here. So although it doesn't make sense in this example, I can include text just fine. Okay, so anyway, what I want to do here is theta is a decimal, and I want to make sure everything's aligned. I can have anywhere from 1 to 3 digits, so let's make this a width 3. Yeah, it's looking a lot better. It doesn't line up with theta though, so actually I think I want to leave more space. So the word theta has 5 letters in it, so I think it would actually make more sense to make this 5. Okay, that lined up nicely. Do something similar with radians. So radians is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I want that to be a floating point number. Let's see, we want to probably only want 2 decimal places for it. Yeah, there we go, that's better. Let's see, we could do similar sort of stuff with the cosine and the sine here as well. Well, first of all, got an extra space in there. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 for each of these. We'll make them 10.2f. And there we go, we've created a nicely formatted table. You know, maybe we want 3 decimal places. It's really easy to change. We just go up here and change all these 0.2s to 0.3s. And ta-da. So that's how we can make our nicely formatted output using Python's F strings.